Blood-red streaks painted the evening sky as General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood before the men of the 101st Airborne Division. His weathered face betrayed the weight of command that rested upon his shoulders. The lives of over 150,000 Allied soldiers hung in the balance of his decision. The date was June 5, 1944, and the greatest amphibious invasion in human history awaited only his final order. "You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade," he had written in the message now folded in every soldier's pocket. "The eyes of the world are upon you." In the choppy waters of the English Channel, 19-year-old Private Robert Jenkins clutched the side of his landing craft, fighting waves of nausea that had nothing to do with the lurching vessel. Around him, grim-faced men checked their weapons for the dozenth time, some praying silently, others staring blankly at the horizon. Jenkins had enlisted just after his 18th birthday, a farm boy from Nebraska who had never seen the ocean before joining the Army. Now he was part of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one, tasked with landing on a stretch of French coastline codenamed Omaha Beach. The invasion, Operation Overlord, represented the culmination of years of planning. Allied commanders had devised an elaborate deception campaign, Operation Bodyguard, to convince German forces that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. As noted in The Decision to Launch, published by The Atlantic in 1969, Hitler's belief that Normandy was merely a diversion represented perhaps the greatest intelligence triumph of the war. Across the Channel, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent months reinforcing the Atlantic Wall, a system of bunkers, artillery positions, and obstacles designed to repel any Allied landing. Rommel, the desert fox who had earned his reputation in North Africa, understood the critical importance of the first 24 hours. "The war will be won or lost on the beaches," he had reportedly told his staff. "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive." Back in England, meteorologists delivered troubling reports to General Eisenhower throughout the day. The original date for Operation Overlord had already been postponed due to unfavorable conditions. A narrow window of opportunity appeared for June 6th, presenting Eisenhower with an agonizing choice: launch the invasion in marginal conditions or risk further delays that could stretch into weeks. In underground war rooms beneath London, Allied planners monitored German defenses and weather patterns with equal intensity. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had initially opposed the cross-channel invasion strategy, now threw his full support behind the operation. "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies," he had told Stalin at the Tehran conference 6 months earlier, referring to the elaborate deception measures protecting Overlord's true target. Aboard. The command ship USS Augusta, General Omar Bradley reviewed the final intelligence reports. His force would attack 2 beaches codenamed Omaha and Utah. To their east, British forces under General Miles Dempsey would assault beaches codenamed Gold, Juno, and Sword. Linking these beachheads would be the first critical objective once forces moved inland. The machinery of invasion was already in motion. Airborne divisions were preparing to drop behind enemy lines hours before the seaborne landings. Their mission: secure key bridges and crossroads to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. For the American 82nd and 101st Airborne divisions, this meant parachuting into the darkness over the Cotton Tam Peninsula. As night fell across England, chaplains held final services for men who would soon face combat. In airfields, ports, and assembly areas, the tension was palpable. Some veterans of earlier campaigns in North Africa and Sicily offered advice to nervous replacements. Others wrote final letters home, entrusting them to friends in case they didn't return. General Eisenhower visited as many units as possible, offering encouragement and resolving last-minute issues. In a moment captured by a military photographer, he spoke casually with paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, asking one soldier about his hometown and telling another about fishing trips from his Kansas youth. Behind his confident demeanor lay the contingency statement he had drafted earlier, accepting full responsibility if the invasion failed. The greatest armada ever assembled waited for dawn. The die was cast. The first hint of dawn revealed a nightmarish tableau. 5,000 vessels of every description spread across the horizon, their silhouettes emerging from the channel mist like specters. In the lead landing crafts, seasick, infantry could now make out the shoreline of Normandy, a thin strip of sand backed by steep bluffs. Above them, the sky filled with the droning thunder of over 11,000 aircraft. At precisely 6:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, the massive naval bombardment commenced. The battleship USS Texas unleashed its 14-inch guns on German positions above Omaha Beach, the concussive blast rattling the teeth of men waiting in the landing craft. Each shell weighed as much as a small automobile and screamed toward shore with mechanical precision. The noise was beyond description, recalled Sergeant Thomas Valance of the 1st Infantry Division in an interview for the National D-Day Memorial Foundation. The battleships firing, the rockets from the landing craft, the German artillery responding. It was as if the world was ending. Private Jenkins and his unit were in the 4th wave scheduled to hit Omaha Beach. From their position, they could see the first landing craft lowering their ramps. Almost immediately, murderous machine gun fire erupted from the German positions. Men pitched forward into the water, many drowning under the weight of their equipment before reaching shore. Others made it to the beach only to be cut down as they sought cover behind beach obstacles. The meticulous Allied planning had encountered its first major setback. Strong currents had pushed many landing craft off target. At Omaha Beach, nearly all the amphibious DD tanks designed to provide covering fire had sunk in the rough seas. The naval bombardment, while impressive, had failed to neutralize the German defensive positions. The Air Force bombing runs had overshot their targets, leaving the beach defenses largely intact. According to Overlord D-Day and the Battle for Normandy, by military historian Max Hastings, the American forces at Omaha faced the most formidable defenses and the most determined resistance. Of the 5 beaches assaulted on D-Day, Omaha would extract the highest toll. The German 352nd Infantry Division, a veteran unit not expected to be present according to Allied intelligence, poured devastating fire onto the exposed Americans. From concrete bunkers and carefully positioned trenches, German gunners had pre-sighted their weapons on the beach exits and underwater obstacles that channeled the attacking forces into killing zones. Colonel George Taylor of the 1st Infantry Division, seeing the men pinned down under withering fire, rallied his troops with words that would become legendary. 2 kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here. Miles to the west, American forces landing at Utah Beach faced a different scenario. A navigational error had landed them in a less defended sector, and they pushed inland with relatively light casualties. By mid-morning, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president and at 56 the oldest man and only general to land in the first wave, was calmly directing traffic on Utah Beach, his walking stick in hand as he organized the follow-up waves. "We'll start the war from right here," Roosevelt had declared upon realizing they had landed off target, a decision that likely saved hundreds of American lives. In the British and Canadian sectors, Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, progress varied. Canadian forces at Juno initially suffered heavy casualties, but pushed farther inland than any other Allied force by day's end. British troops quickly secured their beachheads, but encountered stiff resistance as they approached the city of Caen, a key objective. Back at Omaha, the situation remained critical through mid-morning. Small groups of determined American soldiers began working their way up the bluffs between the German strongpoints. Naval destroyers, seeing the desperate situation, moved dangerously close to shore, risking running aground to provide direct fire support against German positions. Lieutenant John Spaulding led one such group up the bluffs at Omaha. "We were just a handful of guys," he later wrote in his memoirs, "but somehow we knew that everything depended on getting off that beach." By noon, the first tenuous footholds on the bluffs had been established, and the German defenses began to crack. By the end of that bloody morning, the invasion hung in precarious balance. As dawn broke on June 6th, American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were already fighting for their lives. Their drop, conducted in the early morning darkness, had scattered units across the Cottontail Peninsula, far from designated landing zones. In some cases, Entire sticks of paratroopers had been dropped into flooded marshes, deliberately inundated by German forces. Private John Steele, of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, descended silently toward the small village of Sainte Mère-Église, only to have his parachute snag on the church steeple. For hours he hung there, feigning death as German troops moved below him. The image of his dangling figure would later become one of the enduring symbols of D-Day, memorialized in the film The Longest Day, and by a parachute effigy that hangs from the church steeple to this day. Despite the scattered drops, the elite paratroopers adapted quickly. Following the axiom, "If you're alone, you're the point," small groups began improvising attacks on German positions. The distinctive clicking sound of their cricket noisemakers, children's toys issued to help identify friendly forces in the darkness, became signals of hope as scattered units linked up. Lieutenant Richard Winters found himself leading a handful of men from Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, in an attack on a German artillery battery at Brécourt Manor. With just 12 men, Winters neutralized a 4-gun battery that had been firing on Utah Beach, destroying the guns and capturing valuable intelligence. This action would later be taught at West Point as a textbook example of small unit leadership. As documented in Stephen Ambrose's D-Day June 6, 1944, the airborne forces created such confusion behind German lines that the defenders could never mount a coherent counterattack against the vulnerable beachheads. By midday, General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne, had gathered enough of his scattered division to begin securing key causeways from Utah Beach and establishing blocking positions to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast. Despite landing with only his pistol, a knife, and a cricket, Taylor had established an effective command post and was coordinating operations throughout the American sector. Meanwhile, the British 6th Airborne Division had executed a stunning precision raid to capture Pegasus Bridge, a vital crossing over the Caen Canal. Led by Major John Howard, glider-borne troops landed within yards of their objective and secured the bridge in less than 10 minutes. When the first relief forces from Sword Beach linked up with Howard's men later that day, a British officer allegedly offered the traditional greeting. "Sorry we're late, old chap." Behind German lines, the French resistance launched coordinated attacks on rail lines, communication centers, and power stations, implementing plans developed over months with Allied intelligence. These sabotage operations significantly delayed the German response to the landings, preventing critical reinforcements from reaching the front. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill monitored reports from the front with characteristic intensity. "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning," he had said, after El Alamein. Now, with Allied forces established in France, his words seemed prophetic. At Omaha Beach, Private Jenkins had finally made it off the blood-soaked sand. His unit, originally tasked with moving several miles inland on the first day, had instead spent hours clearing German bunkers along the bluffs. Every position had to be taken with grenades, flamethrowers, and close-quarters fighting. By mid-afternoon, American forces had opened several exits from the beach, allowing tanks and other vehicles to move inland. General Omar Bradley, commanding American forces, had spent much of the morning contemplating the possible evacuation of Omaha Beach. Reports reaching his command ship painted a grim picture. It wasn't until early afternoon that the situation clarified, revealing the incredible progress made by small units of determined men. According to a landmark analysis in Command Decisions, published by the U.S. Army Center of Military History, the success at Omaha Beach was ultimately due to the initiative and courage of junior officers and small units who found ways to overcome obstacles when original plans failed. By nightfall, the beachheads were secure but isolated. The next challenge would be linking them together and pushing inland before German reinforcements could organize a counterattack. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been in Germany for his wife's birthday during the initial landings, was racing back to Normandy to take command of the German response. As darkness fell on the longest day, exhausted Allied soldiers dug in along an irregular front. They had gained a foothold in Hitler's fortress Europe, but the battle for Normandy had only just begun. The morning of June 7th dawned with a dense fog blanketing the Normandy countryside. For Private Jenkins, now moving inland with his unit, the pastoral landscape of hedgerows and small farms seemed eerily peaceful after the chaos of the beach landing. The idyllic scene was deceptive. These same hedgerows, called bocage by the locals, would soon become a deadly maze that negated many American tactical advantages. The hedgerows were unlike anything we had trained for, wrote Lieutenant S.L.A. Marshall in his battlefield assessment for the Army. Each field became a fortress, each lane a potential ambush site. These earthen barriers, some dating back to Roman times, stood 5 to 6 feet tall and were topped with dense vegetation, creating natural fortifications that German defenders quickly exploited. By the second day, Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower had committed his reserves to the battle. Fresh troops, vehicles, and supplies poured ashore at all 5 beaches. The artificial harbors, massive engineering projects codenamed mulberries, were being assembled off the British beaches, preparing to receive the millions of tons of supplies needed to sustain the Allied advance. The German response remained fragmented and uncoordinated. Hitler, convinced that the Normandy landings were a diversion and that the main Allied thrust would come at Pas-de-Calais, initially refused to release the panzer divisions held in reserve. According to Hitler's Last Gamble by Trevor Roper, published in the Journal of Military History, this hesitation cost Germany any realistic chance of driving the Allies back into the sea. When Field Marshal Rommel finally reached the front on June 7th, he immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. "The war cannot be won from a defensive position in the West," he reportedly told his staff. His requests to withdraw to more defensible positions were rejected by Hitler, who insisted that every inch of ground be contested. Meanwhile, the Allied buildup accelerated. By the end of the first week, over 326,000 troops, 54,000 vehicles, and 104,000 tons of supplies had been landed in Normandy. Despite this massive influx, the beachhead remained dangerously shallow, with Allied forces nowhere near their planned objectives. On June 8th, elements of the American 29th Infantry Division finally captured the port town of Isigny, while British forces continued to engage German panzer divisions near Caen. The battle for Caen would drag on for weeks, drawing in the elite German forces that might otherwise have been used against the Americans. The British and Canadians tied down the best German units, particularly the SS panzer divisions, allowing the Americans to eventually break out to the west, noted British historian John Keegan in his comprehensive work, 6 Armies in Normandy. By June 12th, American forces from Utah and Omaha beaches linked up, creating a continuous Allied front along the coast. The 101st Airborne secured the vital road junction at Carentan after fierce fighting, further consolidating the American position. Private Jenkins and his squad helped clear the small villages west of St. Lo, encountering sporadic but determined resistance. The French civilian population emerged as both victims and crucial allies. Caught between the massive artillery barrages of both sides, many Norman villages were reduced to rubble. Despite these hardships, local French citizens provided invaluable intelligence on German positions and movements. A remarkable account from the French Resistance Network, published in La Résistance Normande by Jean-Claude Martin, described how a teenage girl bicycled 15 miles through German checkpoints to deliver information about a planned counterattack, likely saving hundreds of Allied lives. In the air, Allied superiority was absolute. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs roamed the skies over Normandy, attacking German vehicle columns and providing close air support for ground troops. The distinctive sound of their engines became known to American infantrymen as the most beautiful music in the world. The German Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages and the long war of attrition, made only sporadic appearances over the battlefield. On rare occasions when German aircraft appeared, the response from Allied fighter squadrons was overwhelming. By mid-June, the character of the battle had transformed. What began as an amphibious assault had evolved into a grinding campaign of attrition among the Norman hedgerows. Innovative American soldiers began developing techniques to overcome these obstacles, including welding steel prongs to tank fronts to punch through the earthen barriers, a modification that became known as the Rhino device. The campaign continued, to consume lives at an alarming rate. Allied casualties during the first week exceeded 15,000 men. German losses, though harder to quantify precisely, were similarly severe and far more difficult to replace. As June drew to a close, Allied commanders recognized that a new approach would be needed to break out of the Norman countryside and into the open terrain beyond, where their superiority in mobility and firepower could be fully leveraged. The battle was far from over, but the success of Operation Overlord was no longer in doubt. The foothold in Fortress Europe had been established, and the liberation of Western Europe had begun. By early July 1944, the Normandy campaign had settled into a bloody stalemate. The Allied forces, now numbering over 1 million men with their supporting elements, remained largely confined to an area less than 20 miles deep. The ancient hedgerows continued to provide perfect defensive terrain for German forces, allowing them to exact a heavy toll for each field and farm taken by the Allies. Private Jenkins, now a veteran of nearly a month of continuous combat, had been promoted to corporal after his squad leader was killed in an artillery barrage. His unit was part of the American forces working their way through the Bocage country toward the key transportation hub of St. Lo. Progress was measured in yards per day, rather than the miles planned by Allied commanders. The hedgerow fighting was a private's war, observed war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who lived alongside the combat troops. Each field was a separate battle, each hedgerow a fortress. There was no glory, only the grinding effort to stay alive and keep moving forward. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, recognized that a new approach was needed. Working with General George Patton, who was still in England with his Third Army awaiting deployment, Bradley developed Operation Cobra, a plan to punch through the German lines with a massive, concentrated blow. The operation would be preceded by the heaviest air bombardment yet seen in the European theater. On July 25th, over 1,800 Allied bombers dropped over 4,000 tons of explosives on a section of the German line, barely 3 miles wide. The earth itself seemed to erupt as bombs fell in saturating patterns designed to eliminate all resistance in their path. According to Decision in Normandy by historian Carlo D'Este, the psychological impact of the bombing on German defenders was as important as the physical destruction. Entire units were rendered combat ineffective, even when they suffered relatively few casualties. The bombing was not without tragedy for Allied forces. In one of the war's terrible ironies, some American bombers released their payloads short of their targets, killing 111 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, one of the highest-ranking American officers to die in the European theater. Despite this setback, Operation Cobra achieved its primary objective. The concentrated American armored forces poured through the gap in German defenses, finally breaking free of the hedgerow country. Suddenly, the war of yards became a war of miles as American tanks raced across the French countryside. For German Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had replaced the injured Rommel, the situation was rapidly becoming untenable. Hitler continued to forbid any strategic withdrawal, insisting that counterattacks reclaim lost ground. These orders bore little relation to the reality faced by German units in Normandy, many of which had been reduced to half their original strength. On August 1st, elements of Patton's newly operational Third Army captured Avranches at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, opening the route into Brittany and the wider expanse of France. Patton, finally unleashed, drove his forces forward with characteristic aggression. "We're going to go through the enemy like crap through a goose," he reportedly told his staff officers as the breakout began. Corporal Jenkins and his division were soon relieved by fresh troops and pulled back for a brief rest. In just over 50 days of combat, his company had lost over 60% of its original strength. The haunted looks on the faces of the survivors told a story that statistics could never capture. Hitler, refusing to accept the deteriorating situation, ordered a massive counterattack. Operation Ludic aimed to drive west from Mortagne to Avranches, cutting off Patton's advancing forces. The attack, launched on August 7th, initially made progress but was quickly contained by Allied ground and air forces. This failed counteroffensive created the opportunity for one of the war's most decisive maneuvers. Allied forces, with British and Canadian armies holding the eastern flank and Patton's Third Army swinging wide to the south, began to encircle the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket. As reported in The Falaise Gap, a groundbreaking analysis published by the Royal Military College of Canada, the potential for complete destruction of German forces in Normandy was unprecedented on the Western Front. The gap between Allied forces was closing, with only narrow corridors remaining for German escape. By mid-August, German units were in full retreat, attempting to escape the tightening Allied noose. Thousands of vehicles and tens of thousands of troops were caught in Allied bombing and artillery barrages as they fled eastward through an ever-narrowing corridor. The Falaise Pocket was finally sealed on August 21st, though thousands of German troops had managed to escape. The battlefield they left behind was apocalyptic in scale, the roads and fields littered with thousands of destroyed vehicles and the bodies of men and horses killed during the desperate retreat. Canadian General Guy Simonds described the scene. The battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest battlefields of the war. The sight was so terrible that it is not readily describable in words. By the end of August, Paris had been liberated and Allied forces were approaching the German border. The Battle of Normandy had cost the Allies approximately 209,000 casualties, while German losses exceeded 400,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The liberation of Western Europe, set in motion on those blood-soaked beaches on June 6th, had become an unstoppable tide. The crisp autumn air carried a hint of victory as Corporal Robert Jenkins, now battle-hardened and wary, paused with his unit at the German border in September 1944. Behind them lay the liberated nations of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Ahead stood the formidable defenses of the Siegfried Line and the German homeland. The road from Normandy's beaches had been long and costly, but the ultimate outcome of the war no longer seemed in doubt. Jenkins pulled from his pocket the crumpled letter that had arrived the previous week, news that his younger brother had enlisted and would soon be shipping out for the Pacific. With a veteran's eyes, he reread General Eisenhower's D-Day message, still folded in his wallet. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. How prophetic those words had proven. The price of victory in Normandy had been staggering. Over 400,000 Allied and German casualties in less than 3 months of fighting. Entire divisions had been shattered in the hedgerows, rebuilt with replacements, and shattered again. The pastoral landscape of northern France had been transformed into a massive military cemetery. The true heroes of D-Day were the men who did not return. General Omar Bradley would later write in his memoirs, A Soldier's Story. They gave everything for a cause they knew was just. Their sacrifice purchased the liberation of a continent. In the months following the Normandy breakout, the strategic impact of Operation Overlord became increasingly apparent. The Second Front demanded by Stalin since 1941 was now a reality, forcing Hitler to divert precious resources from the Eastern Front. The industrial might of America, channeled through the beachheads and artificial harbors of Normandy, had transformed the balance of power in Western Europe. According to the D-Day Encyclopedia, published by the Eisenhower Center for American Studies, the Normandy landings represented the irreversible turning point of World War II in Western Europe. From that moment, German defeat was not a question of if, but when. The campaign had showcased both the strengths and weaknesses of the Allied war machine. The logistics of the invasion, moving millions of men and their equipment across the English Channel and sustaining them in combat, represented an unprecedented achievement in military planning. Conversely, the difficult hedgerow fighting revealed tactical limitations that cost thousands of lives before being overcome. For the surviving veterans like Jenkins, the memories of those days would never fade. The terror of the beach landing, the chaos of the scattered airborne drops, the grinding hedgerow battles, and finally the exhilaration of the breakout. These experiences forged bonds between men that would last for the remainder of their lives. 2. The decades that followed, the significance of Operation Overlord only grew in historical perspective. The battle represented not just a military turning point, but a moral victory. Democratic nations coming together to confront and defeat totalitarianism. The cemeteries scattered across Normandy, with their precise rows of white crosses and stars of David, would become permanent reminders of both the cost and purpose of the war. 50 years after the invasion, Corporal Jenkins, now a grandfather, with silver hair, would return to Omaha Beach for a commemoration ceremony. Walking along the shoreline where so many had fallen, he would find it difficult to reconcile the peaceful scene with his memories of fire and steel. The bunkers remained, now crumbling and covered with vegetation, silent witnesses to history. President Bill Clinton, speaking at the 50th anniversary ceremonies in 1994, captured the significance of what had been accomplished. These men were part of a generation that saved liberty, democracy, and human dignity from the abyss. They did nothing less than save the world. The technological innovations born of necessity during the Normandy campaign transformed modern warfare. The development of amphibious warfare techniques, air-ground coordination, artificial harbors, and specialized armored vehicles all stemmed from the challenges faced and overcome during Operation Overlord. As noted in Engineering Victory, published by the Society of Military Engineers, the mulberry harbors used at Normandy represented one of the greatest engineering achievements of the war. That these massive structures could be built in secret, towed across the English Channel, and assembled under combat conditions demonstrated the industrial and technical superiority the Allies had achieved. For the French civilians who lived through the battle, the legacy was complex. Liberation came at the cost of their homes, livelihoods, and in many cases, their lives. Estimates suggest that over 20,000 French civilians died during the Normandy campaign, many killed by Allied bombing and artillery. The gratitude for liberation was genuine, but so too was the grief for what had been lost. In the post-war years, the Allied nations would create new institutions designed to prevent such conflicts in the future. The United Nations, NATO, and what would eventually become the European Union all grew from the determination that the sacrifices of World War II should not be in vain. The courage displayed on Normandy's shores reverberated through history, inspiring subsequent generations. The landing beaches, Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, became hallowed ground, their names permanently etched in the annals of military history. As Jenkins stood at the German border with his unit in September 1944, he could not have known that the war would continue for another 8 difficult months. Ahead lay the Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine, and the final collapse of Nazi Germany. But the decisive corner had been turned on those Norman beaches and in the hedgerow country beyond. The legacy of D-Day endures as a testament to what free nations can accomplish when united against tyranny. In the words of General Eisenhower, spoken on the 10th anniversary of the invasion, "Without victory in Normandy, the war could not have been won. The road to Berlin began on those beaches." For Jenkins and his generation, the obligation to remember would be passed to their children and grandchildren. The story of American bravery on Normandy's shores would be told and retold, a defining chapter in the longest, most destructive war in human history, and a reminder of both the terrible cost of conflict and the inspiring heights of human courage.